The C-47 circled the fire several times before dropping the crew. The spotter, Earl Cooley, lay flat on the floor on the left side of the open door, with headphones on so he could talk with the pilot, and the foreman, Wag Dodge, lay on the right side of the door so that he and the spotter could watch the country together and talk without the crew hearing much of what they were saying. They were both experienced and good. In a later statement, Fred Stillings, administrator of the smoke jumping project, said, quote, "In my judgment, they were the best available for the jobs assigned," end of quote. And Cooley, remember, was one of the first 2 jumpers ever to parachute on a forest fire. Later, he was to become a successor to Stillings and administrator of the smoke jumping project himself. Cooley is the only smoke jumper I ever heard say, "I don't know why, but I was never afraid to jump. It keeps others awake at night." He's a fine guy, but there is something not in him that is in us. He was always used on rescue work. When some bush pilot didn't clear a ridge, Cooley was sent to the top of the mountain to separate the pieces of the fuselage from the pieces of the pilot, and put the latter pieces in a pack sack and bring them back. After finishing a couple of his rescue stories, he says, "What the hell? If you work for the Forest Service, what do you expect of life?" As far as I know, he has never answered that question except to himself. Even lying on the floor of the plane, Wag Dodge was unwrinkled and handsome in his intentedness. Like a fair number of men who can make anything with their hands, he was fastidious in his dress. His wife said when he returned after a fire and his crew were black to the inside of their skins, he was a fashion plate coming down the steps of the plane. Even after his return from the Mann Gulch fire, where the fire had burned over him, and he had stayed until all the bodies were recovered, he seemed as fastidious as ever until she got close enough to him to see the stain of tobacco juice at each corner of his mouth. To her knowledge, this was the only time he had ever chewed tobacco. She and I have known each other off and on for most of our lives, and we have known the Blackfoot River, where her ranch house stands, even longer. He said to me when we were married, "You do your job and I'll do mine and we'll get along just fine." Then she said to me, "I can't help you much. I don't know much about smoke jumping." And I didn't know any of the smoke jumpers. We never talked about them and he never invited them home, she added. I loved him very much, but I didn't know him very well. If he said my red drapes were black, I would say, trying to keep myself intact, "Yes, Wag, my red drapes are black." His smoke jumpers didn't know much about him either, and he knew almost nothing about them. They knew he was one of the most experienced jumpers in the outfit, having been with the jumpers from 1 year after their founding. All told, he had been 9 seasons with the Forest Service, and since 1945, he had been a smoke jumper foreman. Actually, being so gifted with his hands may have been an indirect cause of the tragedy ahead of him. The smoke jumpers have never had a fixed organization like the military, and the same squads and officers, in the case of the smoke jumpers, a foreman and a squad leader. The crew about to be dropped on Mann Gulch had never before worked on a fire under Dodge. Since the cost of keeping separate crews intact during a hot fire season would be prohibitive, a list is posted of all the jumpers and overhead foremen, squad leaders, and spotters. And when a man has been on a fire, he is dropped to the bottom of the list and has to work his way back up. No one knows who or how many will be called next, especially since the number of jumpers dropped on a fire can vary from 2 men to several plane loads. You don't have to be an administrative genius to see in this organizational scheme of things the possibility of calamity in a crisis. The Forest Service, realizing some of the danger that might arise in a clutch when men whose lives depended upon each other did not know each other, had instituted a 3-week training course at the beginning of each fire season in which crew members and overhead worked together. Whether this course produced much familiarity between crew and overhead is a question not worth asking about Mann Gulch. Wag Dodge was so good with his hands that in the spring of 1949, he had been made barn boss in charge of the maintenance of the base, and so had been unable to take part in the course. Another question is sure to be asked before the fire in Mann Gulch is forever cold. Was the 3-week training course adequate to the emergency Smokejumpers must meet? The Smokejumpers were still a young outfit that hadn't figured itself out yet, and it still had to fight for a budget. It didn't have money, for instance, to keep many of the jumpers around the base, unless there were a lot of fires burning. So when things were quiet and they were sent out on projects, which might mean that a jumper would find himself on a crew building trail, and that's about as unenlightened work as you can get in the woods or anywhere else. One thing, though, that smoke jumpers have been taught well from the beginning is pride, and you can't be much of a firefighter without it. And without it, you certainly can't jump out of a plane when you get sick every time you leave the ground, as some jumpers do. From the beginning, one of the great realities of the smoke jumpers is its romanticism. There's nothing wrong with romanticism except that sometimes it isn't enough. They were jumping into one of the roughest pieces of country Lewis and Clark had seen on their long journey to the Pacific, one that does not pardon weakness on a hot afternoon of a burning summer. The foreman who lay on the right side of the door of the C-47 was in many ways all that a foreman in the smoke jumper should be. A foreman is supposed to do everything his men do, and do it first and better. Dodge could do all that with a margin to spare. He could do things with his hands approaching artistry. He was impeccable and inflexible, but he didn't tell his wife much, and he also didn't know most of his crew, even by name, and they didn't know him except by name. They spotted the fire and circled it once. In their statements to the Forest Service Board of Review after the fire, the pilot, the spotter, and the foreman agree that when first spotted, the fire covered between 50 and 60 acres and was burning on the ridge between Mann Gulch and Meriwether Canyon and partway down the Mann Gulch side, threatening but not as yet burning into Meriwether. Even from the air, the fire's brief history could be read. It had started on the Mann Gulch side, as it turned out, by lightning the afternoon before, had made a run for the top, and had burned hot enough to crown on the way up. Then the crown had burned out, never burning hot enough to start any spot fires. On the ridge, where the fire seemed to be most active, it was burning downhill into a saddle, where the fuel, chiefly grass, was thin. Besides, a fire generally burns slower downhill than up, ashes rolling downhill more slowly than flames rise up it. It was 2:30 when the plane left the smoke jumper base in Missoula, and around 3:10 in the afternoon when the fire was first spotted from the plane, late enough for the wind and the temperature to start easing off. And although August 5th, 1949 was in the middle of a heat wave, and the official temperature in Helena, 25 miles away, was 97 degrees Fahrenheit, the hottest day on record, and the fire danger rating was as high as 74, with 100 as maximum, yet all three observers, as they circled the fire, regarded it as a routine. A spotter always has the right, although he doesn't like to exercise it, of returning to the base without jumping his men if he thinks the wind too strong, 20 miles or more an hour, or the terrain or the fire too dangerous. Cooley and Dodge took a good look at the fire, thought it more or less routine, and figured the crew would have it under control by 10 o'clock the next morning. They referred to the smoke leaking out of the ridge as merely a cauliflower, although soon it was more like a leak in a lobe of the brain of the universe. On the second swing around, they were trying to pick out a landing area. They were also trying to get some idea of the general lay of the land, which was unfamiliar to them. They had been sent from their base in Missoula without maps, on the poor excuse that there would probably already be ground crews on the fire with maps. Even if there had been, it would have made no difference. The fire was located in the Gates of the Mountains wild area, or roadless area, just east of the Missouri River, some 20 miles north of Helena, at a point near the top of the ridge between Mann and Meriwether Gulches. The general area is steep and jagged on the Meriwether side and is said to be one of the roughest areas of the Continental Divide, east of the Continental Divide. From the official report of the Board of Review, Mann Gulch Fire, Helena National Forest, August 5th, 1949. Mann Gulch is a dry gulch, 2.5 miles long, that runs into the lower end of the spectacular stretch of the Missouri River called the Gates of the Mountains, by the first white men who entered them, Captain Meriwether Lewis, when on July 19, 1805, he camped his party at the mouth of the gulch now bearing his first name. Immediately downriver from Meriwether Canyon is Mann Gulch, where the fire started near the top of the ridge between the two gulches. And almost immediately downriver from these two gulches, the gates opened to the plains. Quote, "From the singular appearance of this place, I called it the gates of the Rocky Mountains," end of quote. Captain Lewis said in his journals, "Its singular appearance makes it a fitting backdrop for early and everlasting drama in which nature plays the leading role. If you are coming upstream from yellow flat plains, as Captain Lewis and Captain Clark had been for over a year, you can observe even at a great distance how there is something about mountains that hates to be plains. Far, far ahead are the mountains black with the haze that makes mountains look from the plains as if they were clouds of smoke from a great forest fire. As they and you come closer, the haze of the mountains breaks apart and reluctantly allows the yellow plains a final appearance. This is literally the way it was in Mann Gulch before the fire burned it out in a matter of minutes. It was a place in the gates where the struggle between mountains and plains came face to face. Below Mann Gulch belongs to the plains, upriver to the mountains and timber. Mann Gulch itself, where the grave markers was yellow with tall grass. The differences are not only scenic, there are differences between the behavior of grass and timber fires, and the differences can be tragic if firefighters don't know them. The Smokejumpers were on their way to a blow-up, a catastrophic collision of fire, clouds, and winds. With almost dramatic fitness, the collision was to occur where vast geological confrontations had occurred millions and millions of years ago, where old ocean beds, the bottom of inland seas, were hoisted vertically by causes too long ago to be now identified, and were then thrust forward by gravity into and over other ocean beds, cracking and crumbling them, and creasing them into folds and creating a geological area called in the subdued language of scientists the disturbed belt. A belt that includes in its geological history much of not only northwestern Montana, but western Alberta and eastern British Columbia. The disturbed belt, in turn, is a loosely tied part of a much larger geological formation scientists call the overthrust belt. This overthrust formation not only includes the front or face of the Rockies from western Alberta and eastern British Columbia down through Glacier Park and northwestern Montana, the disturbed belt. It extends in both directions to northern Canada and Alaska and all the way to central Mexico. Prior to the formation of this gigantic extrusion, some 150 million years ago, large portions of the western margin of our continent, which then lay several hundred miles east of our present Pacific coast, were covered by deep layers of sedimentary rocks, limestone and sandstone, deposited there by transient inland oceans, which must have been something like Hudson Bay. As the western continent was raised, squeezed, and compressed, great slabs of sedimentary layers slid over each other inland or eastward for a distance varying from a few miles to 100 miles or more. The present cliffs and the gates of the mountains are the rearings and collisions and roarings of the bottoms of oceans as they stood up like sea beasts struggling to prevent anything from finding a way around them. The cliffs on the sides of each canyon are bases to arches that once rested on the cliffs, as is proved by the matching strata on the opposite cliffs. But the key to the arch that once joined the cliffs has gone off somewhere and been replaced by the eternal arch of Montana sky. In the gates of the mountains there have been many blow-ups. Now there are many rattlesnakes, and nothing more fragile than mountain goats, themselves tougher than the mountains they disdain, although at a distance they are white wings of butterflies, floating up and down and sideways across the faces of fragments of arches and cliffs, touching but never becoming attached to them. When the Missouri escapes at the gates from around a bend or from under a mountain, it is still clear, but almost immediately after entering the plains, it turns yellow. Like the plains, and from then on, there are plains and plains and plains. Yellow plains parted only by a yellow river. Do not be deceived, though, by the scenic beauty of the gates of the mountains into believing that the confrontations and terrors of nature are obsolescences frozen in stone, like the battles of satyrs in Greek bas-relief remnants of mythology and witnessed, if ever, by dinosaurs, and now only by seismographs. It is easy for us to assume that as a result of the modern science, we have conquered nature. That nature is now confined to beaches for children and to national parks, where the few remaining grizzly bears have been shot with tranquilizers and removed to above the timberline, supposedly for their safety and our own. But we should be prepared for the possibility, even if we are going to accompany modern firefighters into Mann Gulch, that the terror of the universe is not yet fossilized, and the universe has not run out of blow-ups. Yet we should also go on wondering if there is not some shape, form, design, as of artistry in this universe we are entering, that is composed of catastrophes and missing parts. Whether we are coming up or down the gates of the mountains, catastrophes everywhere enfold us as they do the river, and catastrophes may seem to be only the visible remains of defunct happenings of millions of years ago, and the Rocky Mountains only the disintegrated explosions that darkened skies, also millions of years ago, and left behind the world dusted with gritty silicon. At least I should recognize this as much as the same stuff as the little pieces of glass, which in 1980 Mount St. Helens in Washington sprinkled over my cabin, in Montana 600 miles away, and anyone coming down the gates of the mountains can see that the laminations of ocean beds compressed in the cliffs on one side of the river match the laminations in the opposite cliffs, and looking up can see that an arch, now disappeared into the sky, originally joined both cliffs. There are also missing parts to the story of the lonely crosses ahead of us, almost invisible in deep grass near the top of a mountain. What if, by searching the earth and even the sky for these missing parts, we should find enough of them to see catastrophe change into the shape of remembered tragedy? Unless we are willing to escape into the sentimentality or fantasy, often the best we can do with catastrophes, even our own, is to find out exactly what happened and restore some of the missing parts, hopefully even the arch to the sky. Even on the first run over the fire, all pertinent pieces of the plane and its universe began to fall into place and become one preparatory to the jump. The crew, the overhead, the pilot, the airplane, the gulch, the fire in it, and the sky between all readying themselves for the act. Jumping is one of the few jobs in the world that leads to just one moment when you must be just highly selected pieces of yourself that fit exactly the pieces of your training. Your pieces of equipment having been made with those pieces of yourself and your training in mind. Each of the crew is sitting between the other's legs, and all this is leading to a single act performed between heaven and earth by you alone, all your pieces having to be for this one moment, just one piece. If you are alive at the end of the act, it has taken about a minute, less if you are not alive. The jump is that kind of beauty when everything has to be in perfect unison in order for men to commit themselves to what once done cannot be recalled, and at best can only be slightly modified. It becomes the perfectly coordinated effort when a woof is heard on the earth, as the parachute explodes open within 5 seconds after the jumper steps into the sky. If it's more than 5 seconds, a handle has to be pulled to release the emergency chute. The pilot now was circling to see how close he could get the plane and the jumpers to the fire. The circles became closer by becoming smaller and nearer to the ground. Sometimes a smoke jumper pilot gets so near to the ground after the crew jumps, but before he can pull his plane out of the face of a mountain, that he returns to the base in Missoula with evergreen boughs in his landing gear. That is also beautiful, but mathematically can't happen often. It was the time now for the drawing together of the overhead and the pilot. The spotter and the foreman lay on the floor with only the open door between them. The spotter and the pilot were joined together by earphones. The pilot was Kenneth Huber, a good one. He had been flying for the famous Johnson Flying Service for 4 years, and during the war had transported paratroopers. The Johnson Flying Service did all the flying for the smoke jumpers in Missoula on contract and was as much a Western legend as the jumpers themselves. In the Northwest, Bob Johnson, the owner, was a kind of Paul Bunyan of the air. Huber told coolly over the earphones that his altimeter showed the plane had dropped 1,000 feet in a few minutes, and that because of the suction of air in the gulch, he was going to jump the men above the ridge at 2,000 feet instead of the customary 1,200. Cooley knew as a result that the crew and cargo on landing would be scattered more than usual, and this information affected Cooley's and Dodge's choice of a landing area. If Bob Johnson had been piloting his own plane, he probably would have taken it into the gulch and arrived back in Missoula physically exhausted from lifting his plane out of the cliffs, and the plane would have been ornamented with Christmas boughs. On their first pass over the fire, the pilot, the spotter, and the foreman were already looking for a possible jump site. But the job of picking one was primarily the spotter's. The pilot's job, since he generally uses instruments when jumping his men, is to report what he can see on his instruments, and he had already reported considerable wind turbulence in the gulch. Both Cooley and Dodge, looking through the open door, immediately noticed a possible jump area right on top of the ridge and right in front of the fire on its up-gulch side, but almost immediately they said no and shook their heads in case no could not be heard across the open door. Naturally, they were trying to drop their men close to the fire, but without endangering them or their equipment. And a change in the wind, which was blowing up gulch from the river so close to a fire front, might have been the end of both. They were starting with the knowledge from the instruments that the wind had dropped the plane 1,000 feet in minutes, and to this they could add their own stored up knowledge that the top of a mountain is a world particularly devoid of equilibrium. As Cooley, the most experienced of the overhead, said later in explaining his rejection of this landing site, if you have wind turbulence to start with, you should know ahead of time that there will be even more at the top of a mountain, and that at the top, one side will have an upwind and the other side a downwind. Those who died later near the top of the mountain in the upwind. On the next pass, Cooley selected a jump area near the head of the gulch on its north side, where the slope gradually goes off into the bottom and your jumper more or less hits equilibrium. Cooley later told the Forest Service Board of Review that he estimated the jump area to be a strong half-mile from the closest point of the fire and 500 feet below it in elevation. Not only below it, but on its flank, and important also, with few trees and rocks. Dodge finally accepted the site, although first objecting because a helicopter couldn't land there in case injured men had to be brought out. So they all tried to think of everything. But the pilot thought primarily of his instruments, and the foreman thought primarily of his crew, and the spotter thought primarily of everything and made the decision. Then the crew began to stir. They were sitting straddle-legged on the floor, their backs to the cockpit, each man fitting snugly between the legs of the man behind him, so that all 16 jumpers and their equipment could be packed into the plane. They were almost literally one body. The equipment of each man next to him, where the seat had been, and each man between the legs of the man behind. Since the beginning of the flight, the assistant spotter, Jack Nash, had been checking their equipment. Now the men stirred to check themselves, figuring they had better do their own checking since they were going to have to do their own jumping. On the next pass over the fire, the assistant spotter stood by the side of the open door and dropped the hunter orange drift chutes. And on the next circle, the spotter estimated the distance and direction the wind had blown the chutes so he could tell how far ahead of their target he should drop the jumpers. The first stick stood up, a stick being the number of men, usually 3 or 4, who were jumped on each run over the landing area. They stand in front of the open door, one behind the other, the front man with his left foot forward. They are closer together than ever. The man behind the first man stands with his right foot forward so that after the first man jumps, the second man can make one step forward with his left foot and be where the first man was. It is the assistant spotter's job to snap the jumper's static line to a rod in the roof of the plane. The other end of the static line is snapped to his parachute. It is 12 feet long, and if all else goes well, will automatically open the jumper's parachute after he has fallen 12 feet. So, as the moment for jump approaches, the men and the plane get closer and closer together. Some jumpers won't allow the assistant spotter to snap their static line to the plane. They do it themselves. They also have to be careful when they jump not to hang themselves in their own lines. One has. On the next pass, they started jumping. The foreman jumped first. Nearly every jumper fears this moment. If he continues to miss sleep because of it, He doesn't tell anybody, but he quits the Smokejumpers and joins up with something else like the crew that makes trails. Whatever he tries, it is something close to the ground, and he never tries jumping again because it makes him vomit. Fear could be part of the reason they were jumping only 15 men on this day. One had become sick on the flight over. Although he was an experienced jumper, his repressions had caught up with him, and he had become ill on each of his flights this season and had not been able to jump. This was a rough trip, and after he had vomited and crawled out of it in his jumpsuit, he must have made his decision. When he landed back in Missoula, he resigned from the Smokejumpers. It was a record temperature outside, and the air was turbulent, so much so that Salih once told me that they were all half sick and trying to be in their first stick to jump and get on the ground. But weather aside, it was hard to know on what day this or that good man had built up more anxiety than he could handle. And at the last minute on this day, this crew of 15 was jumping 4 sticks of 4 and 4 and 4 and 3. On the ground, however, the crew was to pick up another firefighter who had been fighting the fire alone. So when the showdown came, the crew was again 16. The fear of the jumpers is a complicated matter because in some ways a part of each of them is not afraid. Most of them, for instance, believe that God is out there, or a spirit or something in the sky that holds them up. You wouldn't dare jump, they say, if it was empty out there. Also, they say, why be afraid? You're jumping in a parachute, and the government made the parachute, didn't it? This is connected with their thinking that guys who hang glide from the tops of big mountains surrounding Missoula are crazy. They're crazy, the Smokejumpers say. They don't have a government parachute. So in some strange way, they think they're jumping on the wings of God and the government. This does not keep them from worrying some nights, maybe every night, before they jump. And it does not keep some of them from vomiting as they are about to jump. Understandably, Smokejumpers have an obsession about their equipment. Although they change from one fixation to another, the equipment is nearly always somewhere on their mind, and as they get close to the jump, equipment is about all that is on their mind. They know they're about to live or die on a man-made substitute for wings furnished by the government. They start saying to themselves, as if it had never occurred to them before, what the hell does the government know about making a parachute that will open 5 seconds after it starts to fall? Not a damn thing. They just farm it out to some fly-by-night outfit that makes the lowest bid. As the jump nears, their general fears focus on what seems the least substantial and the most critical piece of their equipment, the static line that is supposed to jerk the parachute open with a woof 12 feet after it drops from the plane. The attention the jumper has to pay to the elaborate and studied ritual of jumping helps to keep his fears manageable. He stands by the spotter lying on the left of the door who holds the jumper by the left foot. The next signs are by touch and not by word. The whole flight is made with the door open, unless it is going to be a very long one, so words can't be trusted in the roar of the wind. Using the sill of the open door as a gun sight, the spotter waits for the landing area to appear in it, and next allows for the wind drift. The spotter then says go or something like that, but the jumper doesn't step into the sky until he feels a tap on the calf of his left leg. And in his dreams, he remembers the tap. With the tap, he steps into the sky, left foot first, so that the wind drift will not throw him face first into the plane's tail just to his left. He leaves for Earth in the tuck position somewhat like the one he was in before he was born. This whole business of appearing on Earth from the sky has several likenesses to nativity. The jumpers are forced into this crouch prenatal momentum almost by the frame of things. The jumper, unlike the hang glider, is not up there for scenic purposes. He comes closer to plummeting than to guiding. He is to land as close as possible to the target the spotter has picked, and all the jumpers are supposed to do the same, so no time will be lost in collecting and piling their stuff in the same pile and being off to the fire. In order to drop as straight as possible, the jumpers originally would stand straight up in front of the door as the plane and spotter would say, "Do you see the jump spot down there?" But if the jumper was a new man, the spotter wouldn't look to see if the jumper was seen. He knew the jumper would be standing rigid with his eyes squeezed shut, looking as if he were looking at the distant horizon. but the spotter needed to be sure that at least he was heard, would ask again, "Do you see the jump spot down there?" And the new jumper frozen on the horizon would say, "Yes, sir." Then he would get the tap on the left leg, but before he could jump, he had to crouch in the tuck position because the favorite plane of the early smoke jumpers was the Ford Trimotor that had just a small opening for a door. So it was more or less the frame of things that forced smoke jumpers to be born again as he jumped. His whole flight to the ground takes an average of only a minute. This minute is about the only moment a smoke jumper is ever alone. And it is one of the most lonely moments in his life. A smoke jumper never is sent alone to a fire. The minimum number is 2. At their base, smoke jumpers live in their dormitory with roommates, or if they live in Missoula, with their families. At night, they are with their girls, and often with other smoke jumpers who are with their girls. And if they get into a fight at a bar, they're immediately supported by these other smoke jumpers. For the eternity of this 1 minute, smoke jumpers are alone. It is not that they lose faith in God for that moment. It is just that he is not there anymore or anywhere else. Nothing is there except the jumper and his equipment made by the lowest bidder, and he himself has thinned out to the vanishing point of being only decisions once made that he can't do anything about ever after. The moment the jumper starts falling is umbilical. He starts by counting, putting 1,000 in front of each number to slow each count to a second. If he gets to 1,005, he knows he's in trouble, pulls the handle that releases the emergency chute on his chest. If, however, his umbilical relation to the plane is properly severed by his 12-foot static line, his regular parachute explodes. The woof vibrates in the rocks below, and his feet are thrown over his head. So it is to be born in the sky with a loud noise and your feet where your head ought to be. So it is to be born in the sky with a loud noise. The moment you cease to be umbilical, you become seed, blown by the wind. It is very lonely for the young man to be seed in the wind. Although you are seed, the sky still seems like the womb, and you as seed are blown around the sky's interior parts till you light on the top of a tree or hard rocks or grass. The grass often being only a cover for hard rocks. If you land on the top of a tree, you are probably lucky, especially if you have long rope in your pocket by which you can let yourself down to the rocks. But only a small percentage when they touch earth land on the tops of trees. Try as they may to avoid landing on rocks, many do. Landing smoothly from the sky does not come naturally to man. As in life generally, it is most common to land in grass that thinly covers very hard rocks. If a jumper lands on flat ground at all, it is something like jumping off the roof of an automobile going 25 miles an hour. And in 1949, he finished his jump by taking the Allen roll, landing sideways with the right side from the hip down, taking the shock. The upper part of the body continuing to pivot to the right till the body falls on its back and then rolls over on its knees. As a jumping instructor once said, the roll is to spread the pain all over the body. So it is to appear on the earth from the sky. It is not surprising, considering the punishment the jumper takes at both ends of the jump, that no big man can be a smoke jumper, and we have to remind ourselves from time to time that although we keep saying men, most of them are still close to boys, and that they are not very big boys. Most of the 17 or 18,000 visitors a year at the smoke jumper base in Missoula, having heard possibly from smoke jumpers themselves that the smoke jumpers are the Forest Service best, expect to see the Minnesota Vikings professional football team practicing outside their dormitory, but instead they see teams of fairly ordinary looking boys playing volleyball. Their sizes ranging from 5'4" to 6'2", with a maximum weight in 1949 of 190 pounds. The name of the game is not important to smoke jumpers. The competition is. In the smoke jumpers, they don't recruit losers or big men who don't seem to be made to drop out of the sky. It was a fairly rough landing. Sally hit in a lodge pole, his feet just off the ground, but none of the rest of them were lucky enough to break their fall. They rolled through rocks, although only Dodge was injured. Hellman and Rumsey came to help him and found him with an elbow cut to white bone. The cut somehow self-sealed so that it did not bleed. They bandaged the elbow, and Dodge said only that it was stiff, and the next day he said only that it was stiffer. They crawled out of their jumpsuits that made them look part spacemen and part football players. And in 1949, they even wore regular leather football helmets. Then there was wire mesh over their faces, the padded canvas suit with damn little padding, and logger boots. They tagged their jumpsuits and stacked them in one pile. Their work clothes, unlike their jumpsuits, were their own, and they were mostly just ordinary work clothes, Levi's and blue shirts, but hard hats. None in this crew appeared in white shirts at Oxfords, although smoke jumpers have appeared on fires in their drinking clothes when there has been an emergency call and they've been picked up in a bar, and a jumper is quite a sight in a white shirt in Oxfords after he has been on a fire for 3 or 4 days and had a hangover to start with. Then the plane began to circle, dropping cargo. It was being dropped high and was scattering all over the head of the gulch. Because the cargo had been dropped at 2,000 feet instead of the customary 1,200, so the pilot would not have to take his plane close to the ridge tops in the heavy winds. The men had to collect the cargo over at least 300 square yards. In those days, the bedrolls were dropped without benefit of parachutes and popped all over the landscape, some of them bouncing half as high as the trees. The parachutes were made of nylon because grasshoppers like the taste of silk. In a modern tragedy, you have to watch out for little details rather than big flaws. By the end, every minute would count, but it took the crew some extra minutes to collect the cargo because it was so scattered. Suddenly, there was a terrific crash about a quarter of a mile down the canyon from the landing area. It turned out to be the radio, whose parachute hadn't opened because its static line had broken where it was attached to the plane. Another detail, the pulverized radio, which had fallen straight, told the crew about how far down gulch from the landing area they had been jumped. So the spotter must have been aligned for about a quarter of a mile of wind drift. It also told them something else, that the outside world had disappeared. The only world had become Mann Gulch and a fire, and the two were soon to become one and the same, and never to be separated, at least in story. They finished collecting and piling up their cargo. Dodge estimated that the crew and cargo were dropped by 4:10 p.m., but that it was nearly 5 o'clock before all the cargo had been retrieved. Dodge made the double L signal on the landing area with orange sleeves, signaling to the plane all present and accounted for. The plane circled twice to be sure and then headed for the outside world. It headed straight down Mann Gulch and across the glare of the Missouri. It seemed to be leaving frighteningly fast, and it was. It had started out a freight train loaded with cargo. Now it was light and fast and was gone. Its departure left the world much smaller. There was nothing in the universe now but the terminal glare of the Missouri. An amphitheater of stone erected by geology, and a 60-acre fire with a future. Whatever the future, it was all to take place here and soon. Of the smoke jumpers,